It is a raging inferno out here, past 93 degrees Fahrenheit, but it's still a good opportunity to come clean with you guys. I walk every minute of every day and I never sit down. Why is that the case? Is this just an intense case of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder? Is this just a way to stay healthy and lean year round? Well, as it turns out, when I started down this walking journey of mine to become a high volume daily walker, the intention was never to become this, right? Not to turn this into a second unofficial job. It actually came organically because of certain events that transpired back in 2023. I was probably in not the best state of mind. I had lost my brother back in 2021. Probably still dealing with some depression at that time. Kind of on the outs of my marriage at the time. And as a result, I was probably at my heaviest, probably north of 165 pounds. Those days I didn't weigh myself every single day like I do now, but I'm pretty sure I was well over 20, if not 25% body fat. And for my height, that is pretty huge, pretty fat indeed. But anyway, diet and nutrition were things that I didn't even give a crap about. And I was as sedentary as ever. I used to go to bed super late, and I would probably park myself in front of the TV around 1, 2 a.m. watching Dexter on Showtime while pigging out on some Captain Jack ice cream from Miller Ale House. This was back when I was in Florida at the time. And so at that time I was basically trying to eat my fat ass to death. But then something profound happened in 2023. Someone who I wasn't very close with became really sick, my mom. And I just thought it was just age-related. Maybe it was something that was going to be eventually treated with a hospital stay or two. In fact, when I came to visit her in 2023, she had more than likely already suffered her first silent heart attack. And those days, she was practically blind. She was going through type 2 diabetes, and she would just be on the floor all the time, hardly moving at all. I mean, she would just whine and scream and basically call out to anyone who could hear her to kind of get her some food. And the type of food that she craved was, unfortunately, junk food or ultra processed food. So she just wanted, sweet snacks, fast food. She never wanted anything healthy. Fruits and vegetables, not even in her equation. But anyway, when I came and I saw what condition she was currently in, I was the one who took the initiative and called an ambulance for her, and they took her, and she was shortly admitted. They basically ran all sorts of tests. They confirmed that she did indeed have type 2 diabetes, and she was also non-compliant for type 2 diabetes. Her HbA1c, her glycosylated glucose, which basically shows you the progression of type 2 diabetes, at least over a long-term period, over the past 90 days, it was just out of range. Her glucose, her fasting glucose, was also out of range, and probably north of 400 or 500, which is excessive. And she had been prescribed some medications by her primary care physician to control her diabetes, but of course she was non-compliant on those. Turns out she was depressed, and she had already given up on life. And of course I was nowhere in the picture. I was in Florida trying to rescue my relationship, and then one day I received a phone call from my brother, and he had he was just freaking out over the phone, telling me that he could barely revive her, or she'd gone super cold and she wasn't waking up. They called the paramedics. I was on the phone the whole time, and yeah, yeah, that's usually what happens when you're taping out here in the wild. But anyway, yeah, paramedics came and they pronounced her dead on the spot. They had no means whatsoever to resuscitate her. They had tried all life-saving measures that they could, as paramedics at the scene of the home, and she was pronounced dead. And I basically heard them make the announcement over the phone. So yeah, very sucky experience to also kind of share on this call. Give this call call. Yeah, I'm still in work mode on this video. But what does this have to do with me walking incessantly? So at that time, 10,000 steps a day was not even a goal. 10,000 steps, maybe I hit it occasionally when I went out for long walks with my dogs. But after that event, after I realized what had happened already now to my brother and my mom, both of whom were extremely sedentary for years on end, they were just almost 100% of the time consuming ultra processed junk food. And even if my family members put a stop to bringing that sort of crappy food home, even despite that, they just kept on being sedentary. They would never go for walks. They would never move around the house. They would just park themselves on a sofa or in a chair and then expect food to just be brought to them. And then after that, they would eat and then go straight to bed. So hardly ever they were walking around. What they didn't realize, what none of us realized at the time, was that being sedentary in itself is a disorder. Being sedentary is also a risk factor for the number one cause of mortality out there, which is metabolic syndrome, which includes all of the most dastardly diseases out there, like heart disease, diabetes, and cancer, right? The three big killers. Sitting kills. So if you're spending an exorbitant amount of time sitting, you're actually living less. Those who sleep less live less, and those who sit a shit ton are probably not setting themselves up for success in their life. So those experiences basically changed my outlook on life completely. Now it wasn't just about being healthy. It was just about not becoming another statistic, not following the path that my mom and brother had previously followed. And my brother, he passed away from ALS. More than likely, most cases of ALS are sporadic, right? They're not always genetic, because no one else in my family ever had ALS, but he was the very first one. Got it when he was 29, not even 30, and he passed away 6 years later, and he was paralyzed that whole time. And then my mom got type 2 diabetes, passed away 2 years later, but both my mom and my brother were always sedentary. We're always ignoring proper diet and nutrition. So I did not want to go down that path, and so I decided to be the complete opposite of what had already transpired in my family. I immediately cleaned up my diet. I immediately started cooking everything for myself. I never cooked a day in my life, but here I was in Florida living by myself. I started to get all of the equipment needed to become my own personal chef. Pots, pans, frying pans, non-stick or 0 calorie non-stick oil spray. And then I started off cooking myself salmon, and then it was a lot of salmon salads in the beginning, and then I graduated to getting lean cuts of meat like chicken breast, and then it became chicken salads. At one point, as I mentioned in a previous video, I was actually using Uber Eats and DoorDash to eat healthy, ordering salads and whatnot, and like chicken subs, but that wasn't making a dent in my weight. I wasn't losing any weight. and I still felt tired and weak. What I didn't know is all of that food that comes from fast food places, so-called healthy food, is still just chock full of chemicals and additive substances that are just, giving you those quick dopamine hits without giving you any real nutritional value. So that's when I took it upon myself to delete those apps from my phone and start cooking on my own. But the biggest difference I made was walking every single place at any time that I had, any opportunity I had to churn out steps throughout the day, I took it. So that's when I went down a rabbit hole and started walking over 10,000 steps a day. But I realized when I walked over 10,000 steps a day, I was still sitting more than half the time. So I would walk for 100 minutes a day, an hour and 40 minutes. I think that's what it is. And then the rest of the time, the remaining 14 hours and 20 minutes that I was awake, I was still like sitting down on the couch watching TV, sitting down on the couch playing video games. I was sitting down to take work calls, do work on my computer, on my laptop. At that time, I think I was working on the Acestar media channel, so I was still like editing videos, creating voiceovers for shorts, using on my laptop, and just sitting the whole time. Then you can only imagine how long it takes to edit, even shorts, right? One 30-second short still takes it took me at least about 2.5 hours to completely edit and then post and all of that stuff that you have to do inside a YouTube studio. So I was still spending quite a bit of time, the majority of my time, sitting down, aka pretty sedentary. So that's why I decided to step it up, go from 10,000 steps a day to 20,000 steps a day. Now I was doing more activities while walking around. So instead of doing those work calls while I was sitting down, I started taking those calls while I was walking around. I would do so many calls just with my camera turned off because that was the best opportunity for me to churn out extra steps. Very quickly, I developed this reputation at work as a guy who always kept his camera off because he was just walking for the majority of the meetings. Sometimes they could hear my slippers or my flip-flops kind of in the background of their calls, and they knew I was basically walking around my living room area when I lived in Palm Bay, when I was in this 4-bedroom home, just me and my 2 dogs. Lots of space for me to walk around. But that was just 20,000 steps. I was still sitting down to eat my meals. I was still sitting down on the couch to watch movies. But I had actually stopped going to restaurants. I had stopped going to movie theaters because every time I went to those places, I would basically spend an exorbitant amount of time sitting on my butt, watching, consuming. So I realized if I could just cut out those instances of where I was sitting for hours on end, what I realized was that any activity that required me to sit for more than an hour was not worth my time. So I stopped going to the cinema, to the movies. I stopped going to a lot of restaurants. And of course, by not going to restaurants, I controlled my calorie deficit, and I was able to complete my very first calorie deficit that same year that I went over 20,000 steps a day. I got down as low as 9.7% body fat. Obviously, I was super skinny and small after that. Obviously, didn't have a lot of muscle to begin with, but I just stepped it up with my my total body workouts, and started just progressively overloading with the weights that I had. I think I was using the Bowflex dumbbells. So I cut out all the activities where I was sitting for hours on end, and then I decided to turn my attention to eating. I decided to look at the time I spent while I was sitting down to eat. And I realized it took me on average for a lot of my meals about 10-15 minutes to completely gobble it down. What if during those 10 to 15 minutes, I know initially at meal times I decided to go for walks. Every time I would eat breakfast, every time I ate lunch, dinner, I would go for a walk. I would go for a 10-20 minute walk on these extremely hot, sweltering days in Florida, where it's even hotter than currently is here in the Northeast. I would still go out for some of those walks with my doggies, but I would actually just go into one of the empty rooms, right? I had a 4-bedroom rental home in Palm Bay, so I would go into one of those empty rooms and just walk around in circles. Maybe I would just like play some music or listen to a podcast or an audiobook, but I would just easily knock out 10-20 minutes just doing that. And a lot of the times, because of my role at the time in 2024 at my current company, I would just answer a lot of emails, draft a lot of Slack messages, or send off a lot of Slack messages while I was walking around in either one of those empty rooms or in my kitchen and living room area. So gradually, those 22,000 steps a day morphed into over 25,000 steps a day. But that was the first change that I made to incorporating walking during mealtime. Obviously, walking after meals greatly aids digestion and absorption, right? But I figured I could go one step further and walk while I was eating. Not only that, I could actually walk while I was working on my laptop. So walking while I was eating was an easier fix. I was able to actually start preparing my meals inside of these Tupperware containers. And then as soon as I was done preparing the meal, I would basically just walk around my living room while I ate it, while I gobbled up every last bite. And just like that, not only was I able to walk for the duration of that meal, which is about 10-15 minutes, but then I would walk an extra 10-20 minutes afterwards to further aid in digestion of that meal. So in all, I was basically walking closer to 20-25 minutes per meal, and I was even at that time eating 4 times a day. And I think at some point I was eating 5 times a day. I split my dinner into 2 meals. But you can imagine how quickly I ramped up from 25,000 to on the brink of 30,000. And what got me over 30,000 steps at the beginning of this year, in January of 2026, was actually investing in a standing desk with a treadmill underneath. That's what allowed me to not only leverage that and use that to walk during my meals, but also leverage that while I was working on videos, right? This was, I had actually stopped working on my YouTube channel that I started last year, which was the Acestar lifestyle channel. But I was still doing a lot of, work on my laptop. I was still working, hybrid. So I was working 4 days a week from home, 3 days a week from the office. So working from home, I would just step onto that treadmill and start walking away. And in the morning, I started getting up a lot earlier in the morning, got up at now 3 a.m. in the morning to fit in extra hours for walking. So between getting up super early in the morning, leveraging the treadmill and standing desk setup in order to walk while I was doing work on my laptop, while I was even holding and hosting meetings, participating in meetings, and then of course on that same treadmill walking away during each meal, I was easily able to cross over 30,000 steps a day. But a very interesting thing happened once I crossed into the 30,000 step a day territory. I developed an allergy to sitting down. Now all of a sudden I couldn't even sit down anymore. If I was seated for even 30 minutes during a call, I would just automatically just pop up and just walk out, go for a little small walk, and then return. Pretty soon I stopped avoiding gatherings and events where I was going to force myself, or I would be forced to sit for hours on end, like 8-hour workshops or all-day workshops. I would probably either avoid them altogether, or I would only go for half of the day. So I would go until maybe like 11, 12, and then just roll out of there around lunchtime. Lunchtime, I also avoided consciously, intentionally, because I knew I would be forced to sit down and have lunch with everyone else. No one else in the world, I would venture a guess, actually stands or walks around while they eat. That's exactly what I do for every single meal. I cannot stand anymore, or I cannot sit anymore to eat it. I'll either stand up, and more than likely, over 95% of the time, I'm going to be either walking on that treadmill once that's functional again. And in the meantime, treadmill or no treadmill, I'm going to be walking around my living room, walking around my kitchen, getting in those steps. So 30,000 steps a day has definitely changed my life. And it's actually made me no longer sedentary. I have completely warded off the risk factor of developing metabolic disease from sitting alone. Of course, there are many other risk factors, but sitting is probably one of the greatest risk factors for heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. And I've been able to achieve that purely through high volume daily walking. And as I mentioned before, 30,000 steps is an amazing accomplishment. It's an amazing step goal, but it's certainly, I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to always be progressively overloading, adding 3,000 additional steps every couple of months. And who knows, I might be easily crossing over 40,000 steps in a few months, or maybe by the end of this year. So no longer am I going to be sitting down. I'm going to be walking as much as possible to live as much as possible. And of course, stay lean for life.